Hello, everyone. Uh, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Tom Hewinger. I'm the Director of Customer Experience at EcoMap Technologies, and I am very excited to welcome you all to one of our ecosystem talks. And today, I'm going to host this presentation and fireside chat with Ben Ide, who's coordinator at Forge North. And we'll be delving into identifying opportunities for equity and startup funding using your Minneapolis St. Paul Startup Guide, or the MSP Startup Guide, as an example data set. Ben, nice to have you. Great to see you. Myself and our audience of ecosystem builders are very excited to learn more. So, Ben, tell us more about you.
Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction, Tom. Thanks for the chance to speak and hear some feedback today. EcoMap. Um, I am the coordinator of Forge North, which is a nonprofit part of the Regional Economic Development Partnership for Minneapolis, St. Paul in Minnesota. I've tried my hand at social entrepreneurship up here, and I've been up here at the university. I studied at the University of Minnesota, gained a bit of experience in science and mathematics, statistics. So yeah, I'm trying to take all that, take the connections that I've grown and that I've been welcomed into in our community, and see if we can uh, move our coalition's goals forward to increase early stage capital, early stage venture raises in Minneapolis, St. Paul, to improve racial equity in terms of the outcomes of the ecosystem and the processes and programs along the way, and increase enterprise engagement in Minneapolis, St. Paul, since we have the highest concentration of Fortune 500s per capita in our region. So players you'll know like 3M, Target, uh, Best Buy, and Medtronic was founded here.
Right. Yeah.
So how
Uh,
can we turn that all into a startup engine that's more equitable and inclusive?
great. Well, then, going from there, then can you talk a little bit more about Forge North and just the Minneapolis-St. Paul region in general in terms of its racial demographics and some of the challenges that you've encountered over the course of your work with Forge North?
Definitely. Uh, Minneapolis, St. Paul is, let's see, if I'm thinking about our startup ecosystem in general, we are fortunate to have a variety of areas of strength. Healthcare, one of the world's leading hubs for medical technologies, food and agriculture with headquarters like General Mills and Land O'Lakes, fintech. I think we have five major banks based out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, enterprise scale software as a service, SaaS. So a breadth of industries, accelerators, incubators, anything you might want to grow a startup. But we, you know, uh, the murder of George Floyd was not an isolated incident. We're a place that, is grappling with a history of redlining and racial exclusion in housing, and as well as myriad other. The Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul was a majority Black owned commercial district that the interstate system demolished. And we're still reckoning with and reconciling with the legacy of racism in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And racial equity has been a part of Forge North's work since before I got the chance to sit in this seat. Trying to understand the ways that high growth entrepreneurship can be one of the tools among many through which we move towards a more equitable and inclusive society where people with great ideas have the chance to bring them into practice and grow wealth or grow impact um, through lenses including the startup ecosystem.
Great. And then before diving into your presentation, can you speak to any of companies currently in the MSP that are raising early stage capital and is there anything we can say about the industries that these companies are within in terms of race and ethnicity within the founders?
I I feel like I could take an hour. I would still run low on excellent founders in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Um, I've talked with founders recently that are mixing sports and artificial intelligence to, view somebody playing basketball or rock climbing and compare their movements with an expert to help them train. Founder who's relocating up from Atlanta. If anyone on the call is from Atlanta, hello. Um, and her technology helps athletes manage their mental health more coherently. There's a local founder working to improve access to healthcare for people with low English proficiency. Minneapolis, St. Paul is home to many Hmong and Hispanic Latino, and especially many migrants from Africa, uh, early generation immigrants from places like Somalia, Ethiopia, uh, and some from West Africa. And I'm leaving out, obviously Dakota and Ojibwe, people who've been here since before any of my ancestors got to the United States. Um, you know, uh, let's see. I could talk about an Afghani chutney that recently launched at Target. Um,
Wow.
there's, yeah, a wealth of resources, a wealth of, categories of startup growth in our area. Um, some exciting new developments in clean energy because, we have
Right.
a major headquarters of Excel Energy in Minnesota. Um, and yeah, one thing that makes my job easier. I don't know if you're going for the shameless plug here, Tom, but having the eco map to help organize all the organizations supporting those founders and make it easier to guide a founder to what they're looking for.
Yeah.
It's an asset. We're still figuring out the full scope of what the guide can do. But if you're in the region, mspstartupguide.com is our example of how this all works.
Right.
And
I didn't have to tee that one up. So thank you, Ben, for
Mhm.
for throwing that out there. Um,
Welcome.
Excellent. Well, with that being said, I mean, you've definitely given us, you've set the stage for all the reasons why this particular topic and presentation is really important. So I'll let you dive in, and we'll also have some questions interspersed throughout for the audience to consider and maybe talk about in the chat. And then followed by this, we'll have some time for a little bit of Q&A with Ben. So without further ado, Ben, take it away.
Sounds like a plan. I This is going to be somewhere between, the business school style. Let's get to the point. Let's make the sell first and then talk about the details. And what I learned to do in undergrad as a physics major of let's really work through the steps and check that we're on the same page. My goal here is not necessarily to tell you I did this and it's right. It's to connect with a global, well, maybe a global, at least a national audience of experts in the startup ecosystem, um, so that we can, check the math, look for missing data points, blind spots, and maybe come up with something that helps us understand the communities that we're serving in a more consistent way. So appreciate you all joining. Part of the reason that we're having this conversation through EcoMap is that Pavel Apir is one of the people I wish I could have this conversation with. So we are all here instead, and we're trying to carry her work forward. So um, anyway, we Forge North, we're a nonprofit. We are part of a group that's trying to drive inclusive economic growth in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And at the end of the work, we hope to advance racial equity. At the earlier stages, we can measure economic disparities. Um, a lot of what's in the middle is how do we identify the opportunities to move from just measuring to actually making change. Uh, and this can be challenging. We've worked with some really talented consultants who were able to look at the small business ecosystem, but not bring things into focus on the startup world specifically. And the other driving force, not just trying to build on what our consultants offered us. The other driving force was that we are fortunate to have a really informed and engaged community of entrepreneur support organizations, many of whom work with all small businesses. And a question I hear from them very often is, why are you focused just on startups? Just this small slice of the overall world of small business. And what impact will that make? And they deserve a quality answer. And this is one of the tools that I've thought about as a way to provide that context. So we're going to talk about a quantitative approach today. It's going to help us, identify high impact opportunities by looking at what are the industries with many deals in our region. So we'd be looking more at healthcare today than at board games, though there are some impressive board game entrepreneurs in town. We'll look at high median valuations per deal. So industries where there's not just a high volume of deals, but where if you start a business, you're likely to get some serious investment in it. And we also want to understand where in the high growth startup ecosystem there are gaps that are correlated to race or ethnicity. So we have to use some way of identifying startups founded by a person of color. But the method is generic. You can apply it to look for successes and challenges for LGBT founders or female founders or veterans who are people of color. Actually, I don't know if Crunchbase tracks veterans. Maybe scratch that last one for the moment. They've improved multiple times over the past 3 years. We have to have some caveats here. Qualitative community engagement conversations are critical if you actually want to understand the full scope of the problem. What is founders' lived experience going through accelerators and incubators? What is different between the Somali community and the Ethiopian community, or the Latino community that's from Peru versus Colombia? How does religion impact things? How does gender impact things? Also, what we're going to arrive at is not prescriptive. It's not going to say, well, we just need to invest more money and that'll solve the problem. We could be looking at upstream challenges to, access technical skills or to be aware of industry needs. And it's not always the case that entrepreneurship is the solution to economic inequities. There are a wide variety of tools that other organizations, I hope in most regions in the country, are providing or proposing to close some of the wealth gaps that have led to other challenges in our society. So at the end of this process, we'll have a graph that looks something like this. We'll plot different industries on it. In general, the further up the graph an industry is, the greater the opportunity cost to a startup ecosystem if we are not funding that industry's startups fully, in startups founded by communities of color or whatever group we're trying to identify inequities alongside. And the further to the left an industry is, the less of a gap there currently is between the level of investment that it's receiving and the level that it would be receiving in a more equitable world. So this is the part where we get into the weeds on why are these industries plotted in these specific places. Any thoughts or questions before we move forward? I think I'm keeping an eye on the chat, but have you spotted anything, Tom?
I've got eyes on the chat, and so far, no questions so far. But yeah, I think that the way you've discussed this graph, it's pretty clear. Would you have any specific examples of and does anything come to mind if you look at industry A, industry B, industry C, that you could assign to those based on where they are in the graph? I know we didn't rehearse this. Hate to put you on the spot.
Right. So long story short, I'm still developing this tool, and this video is being recorded, and I think we'll give the slides. Rudy from EcoMap has requested the slides for afterward. So while we're still figuring out the process, while we are checking our data. Um, I'm wary of like saying which one of these is 3D printing or one of these is um, prosthetics. Like,
Mhm.
because I like the decisions haven't impacted Forge North's policy or goals yet. Um, but maybe in general we could say industry C is probably something your region is known for in its startup
Sure.
space. Like this is something that you're good at. What you might be less clear on is, how much work do you have to do to get it to this um, equity axis. Um, and I'll show some examples at the tail end of the presentation of like what there are industries that have not recorded deals involving a founder of color in the past 5 years, or there are industries where founders of color are performing better, are getting more deals than they would in an equitable world.
Okay.
And I don't know how to interpret, but I have ideas about how to interpret these data points. I'm not sure how to interpret the ones where founders of color are overperforming. Uh, Welcome, Juan. Uh, Good to see you from Charlotte. Anything else before we move along, Tom?
I think we're good. No, let's head in.
All right. Uh, Methodology, always the most fun part of any statistics presentation. The step one, because we have to have some qualitatives before we can dive into the math, is to identify your goal for approaching equity. Um, you might care about, startup capital reaching founders of color or female founders proportionate to their share of your region's total population. You might care about it reaching those founders proportional to their current level of ownership of businesses. So, for instance, in the graphs that you see here from the Small Business Administration, we can see that racial minorities own about 13% of businesses in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is lower than their share of workers in the population. Similarly, for Hispanic entrepreneurs of all small businesses relative to workers in the population, um, veterans in Minneapolis, St. Paul are overperforming their share of workers in terms of ownership of small businesses. So as one person, I am not able to look at these graphs and say, okay, we need 17% of Minneapolis, St. Paul startups to be led by somebody who identifies with being Hispanic and or being a racial minority. It's a process of bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders, especially people from the communities you're trying to serve, to identify. Ideally, at the end of the day, you want a percentage goal that you can compare the status quo against. Um, and, you know, if you have somebody on your team with greater expertise at the American Community Survey or the Annual Business Survey who can delve deeper into the data, please work with them. I'm a little dissatisfied that I'm using this graph as our data source for our goals. But it's fast and it gives you a good starting point. Uh, the next step is that I downloaded data from Crunchbase. The reason I chose Crunchbase is that it includes a field called diversity uh, spotlight. Don't love the name, but it's Crunchbase's call. The They include, so PitchBook only includes data about gender. Crunchbase includes data about race, ethnicity, and as of last year, LGBTQIA led companies. The My advice would be download more data than you think you'll need, because it's once you set this process running, it's hard to go back and add more inputs. Um, but and then also my account, which is the like $50 a month version, has a limit of 1,000 downloads per week or per day. No, 1,000 deals downloaded at once. Um, and if you run into that error with your startup ecosystem, A, good job. You've got a pretty vibrant startup world in your region. B, uh, segment it by date ranges and then just stitch them together in Excel at the end of the day. Like, it's a limit, but you can get around it. And then in case Crunchbase watches this recording, I took this screenshot without being logged in, so it's what you could see from the free version. And I think they have a 7-day free trial in case you want to like speed run making these graphs for yourself. But also kudos to Crunchbase for having more data about founders' racial identity than PitchBook does. I appreciate having access to the information. So the third step, we have the data from Crunchbase. It's in Excel, or probably this would work in Google Sheets. We're going to get to the now what question at the end. I would love if there was a program written where we could feed it Crunchbase data and it would give us the graph without the hundreds of rows of computation that are ahead of us. But I digress. When you're in Excel, this diversity spotlight field has all sorts of descriptions of the identities of the founders of the startups you might be working with. Within that field, check it out. See if it has the level of precision that you're looking for. Is it, maybe you are working in a tribal community and it would be important to understand, which nation the founders you're working with come from. Crunchbase doesn't have those data.
Ben, we have a question for the audience to consider and maybe discuss in the chat for this particular slide. And that's, have any of you been successful in adding missing information about startups in your region to make the aggregate data more accurate, especially in terms of this founder data and this the spotlight field that Ben here is talking about?
Yeah, you've hit two important points here. The diversity spotlight field is not comprehensive. There's one particular prominent Minneapolis-based startup led by a founder of color that is not tagged in that way in this Crunchbase database. The main reason we're using Crunchbase rather than like surveying local founders, other than founders don't want to respond to surveys often, or are over surveyed and under resourced, is so we want to understand how we stack up compared to other regions. And doing some math based on Crunchbase is something that we can control, whereas building a national coalition where we all give the same surveys to all of our founders takes some more effort.
Yeah. Well, and to part of that point there, Chris from our own Baltimore tech ecosystem and Upsurge, do you happen to know how Crunchbase sources their demographic data, if it's self-identified or if it's crowdsourced? And we know you work for Crunchbase, so if you don't know the answer, that's fine.
Right. I've definitely read their blog posts about this as I'm trying to figure out how valid the data are. I believe that Crunchbase relies on investors to tag the racial identity of founders in their portfolios. I don't know to what extent a founder can edit things on their profile. I've tried to like tell Crunchbase, hey, this one is mislabeled, and I don't think I've gotten a response, but I don't work for an investment firm, so that might be part of it. I can send a link after the session to the Crunchbase pages that I've read to try and answer this question for myself. And then maybe a question I'd like to turn back to the audience is, this field is biased in several ways. Crunchbase is just the best source that I'm aware of yet that we could use to make comparisons to other regions across the country. Are there other data sources that we might consider that could tell us maybe with greater accuracy about the amount of money that goes into deals, the industry of deals, and the identity, founders' racial or ethnic identity. And maybe somebody can pass that to the audience in chat, so
Yeah,
they can respond there or volunteer to raise their hands later in the conversation.
we'll keep an eye on the chat.
Awesome. And great question, Chris. I've wondered that myself many times. Um, and I am fortunate that we work with our local venture capital roundtable. So I'd love to talk with them more about, is this something that they regularly, keep updated and or pay attention to, as they interact with Crunchbase. But also, don't want to put more load on people who are already busy. So finding that balance is important. Uh, Another step that is going to have a few data quality asterisks. Um, Crunchbase has a field called funding type that has topics like pre-seed, angel, convertible note, seed, series A, grant. I think accelerator incubator is also in there, but that might be PitchBook. But I had a question similar to Chris's when I first saw these fields about who decides what's a convertible note, who decides what's an angel round, and are those definitions applied consistently across hundreds and hundreds of deals? So my system, because I saw that there was one convertible note above $100 million that was an extreme outlier from the rest of the convertible notes that we were trying to count as early stage. Uh, Rather than, you know, I did eventually just make something up, which was if something is more than four standard deviations away from, I think I said the average deal within each funding type, either by the amount of money raised, so that's these top three examples, or by the funding round labeled. It seemed it seemed like it might have been mislabeled. So just for data quality, thanks, Chris, for the answer about sources for data. Is it Tom Chapman who's part of the Startup Champions Network?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I remember hearing from him at a conference like PitchBook's going to get you 50 or 60% of the information. Crunchbook's going to get you 50 or 60% of the information. They're the best we have. So just it's been a year and a half. Maybe something additional has come along. Maybe Chris and I are missing information that we, as an EcoMap community, can share with each other. But zooming back to this slide, uh, these outliers that are more than four standard deviations away from the average made up about 25% of the money raised, even though they were only about 1% of the deals.
Wow.
So it seemed important if we were trying to get a realistic sense of who's raising early stage capital in Minnesota, maybe those are outliers. Maybe those shouldn't count.
Yeah, and so I have another question for the audience to consider and share your thoughts or bring it to the Q&A. And that's just, has anyone else identified the typical outliers within this within early stage capital, and especially have you found ways to automatically identify those outliers within early stage capital? But I mean, that's a pretty staggering statistic that you just shared there, Ben.
I mean, that 25% is mostly the one convertible note that was way above 100 million.
I can imagine.
Um, but yeah, um, uh, maybe to take a moment, uh, refresh on statistics. A standard deviation is a measurement of, its goal is to indicate, you have a data set, you know what the average of the data is. A standard deviation is a way of measuring, okay, I think it's like a majority of the data will be within one standard deviation on a usual curve. like 5% of it will be more than 2 standard deviations away.
Hmm.
So if you're getting out to 4 standard deviations, you're looking at something that probably isn't part of the central trend of the data. Um, I could probably quote you the mathematical definition of a standard deviation, but I don't think it's
All
germane.
right.
So, as chat thinks about, if you had to look at, if you wanted to compare a startup ecosystem that you're familiar with another one that is outside of your expertise, where you don't know anybody else, what method would you use to identify the outliers in both your ecosystem and that one so that you had a more direct way of comparing them? All right. And step 5, which I believe is the last methodology step. Okay, for the inconsistency of funding types. Oh, by funding amount. Okay, sorry, I'm reacting to something in the chat. Chris, I believe from Baltimore, mentioned that they define stages by the funding amount because the way that funding types are labeled is inconsistent. I like that approach, and I've also noticed that, a healthcare startup going into a phase 1 clinical trial or a consumer packaged good, uh, this is a good transition to the industry slide. Or like a consumer
Well, not,
packaged good that
I'm
needs to
sorry.
build up. Yeah,
For anyone not following the chat, Chris says, sorry, don't mean to get us off track. Happy to talk more about this all in depth. Which absolutely, which is one of the purposes of these webinars is to connect each other, especially within the EcoMap community. So we'd love to find a few minutes at the end of this for maybe some of those connections to happen.
right. Um, but I see this as a perfect segue,
Sure.
because every industry will have different funding requirements. If you're a team of 2 people with 10 years of experience in coding languages, you might be able to stand up an app and get it to 1,000 people or 1,000 users on the Android store with $0 of investment. But if you're scaling your gluten-free pancake recipe from a farmer's market to the local grocery store, you're going to need a bit of cash in hand to buy all the supplies you need and rent a commercial kitchen space. Um, so again, this is why we had industries A, B, and C on that first slide, is the amount of dollars raised by the amount that it takes to get to, whatever is a series A will vary based on industry. Uh, and the reason that it gets its own slide and it's not just read the industry group off of Crunchbase is that, at least as far as I've been able to tell, Crunchbase will tag the industries for any given startup or deal, but it will not give you the simplified industry groups. Um, so there, yeah, the step B takes up more columns than anything else I've ever done in Excel. It's 800 columns of checking the list of industries that a startup is tagged with against the list of industry groups that uh, that industry falls within. Fortunately, Crunchbase gives you the spreadsheet that maps industries to industry groups. But I've still broken Excel when trying to look at these data for thousands of deals at once. And
Right.
hopefully there's an easier way of crunching those numbers. Or maybe there's a column that I haven't found in Crunchbase yet that I could turn on and download with the data to save
Right.
all the time and effort.
Which, yeah, which again, question for the audience is outside of breaking Excel, have you found any simpler methods to identify the startups industry? And again, please share anything in the chat or save it for the Q&A if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, we've been asking more questions of the audience this time. They thought they were going to show up and learn stuff from us. Like, all right. Um, Fortunately, that brings our methodology section to a close. Now we actually start building that graph that you all saw about 20 minutes ago. Um, and this is another mess of computation that I didn't find a good way to, screenshot from Excel. But if we think about, if we think about this, if we think about each row as being its own deal, where we keep track of the funding type, the industry group, the money raised in the deal, and whether or not the startup is part of your target audience, that group that you identified on the diversity spotlight data. We're going to compute aggregate data for each industry group. So you're going to look at all the deals and you're going to see if they fit that industry group. And then you're going to count how many deals fell within that industry group and how many deals within that industry group included your target audience. What I ended up doing was computing the median dollars raised within each industry group across all deals. Using R is a good idea. It's one of those yeah. Uh, you could use R, you could use Excel, you might be able to use Google Sheets to compute the median dollars raised across all deals within that industry group and the median dollars raised by just your target audience within startups in that industry group. Unfortunately, the challenge I've noticed is for some industries, there are no deals or no deals with a known dollar amount that have been closed by a startup founded by founders of color, for instance. So as you'll see in the next slide, we end up relying on, well, 2 slides from now, you'll see I've built my graph based on the median dollars raised across all deals. Okay, this is where I had fun remembering how to use the Microsoft Office equation writing tool. So our horizontal axis is going to talk about within each industry, what is the gap between the deals we have and the deals we wish we had? And we'll be expressing this as a percentage of uh, the total investments that you're already making. So I could read the slide at you, but in essence, the goal is, it's the simplified version would just be, all right, if we know that there are 100 deals in this industry group and we want 30% of those goals to involve communities, founders of color, but only, so that n total times percent goal would be 30. But we know that our current number of deals involving founders of color is 15. So, this part would simplistically say, okay, we need 15 more deals. The challenge is that, 15, if you add 15 deals to this original 100, then those 30 deals over 115 does not equal 30%. You have to make up for the fact that you're adding deals to the total if you want to arrive at the the actual amount that you need to increase deals by. This slide is opaque. I don't know if I'm going to be able to fix that by talking more about it. But if you take the time to work out the math yourselves, I might do it by hand and throw it in the notes. This will get you the sort of computations that I used when making my graph. You can also come up with a different, if you want to use this simplified, here's where we wish we were, here's where we are, and that difference is the total, or that difference is delta n, just ignore the denominator. That's also totally fine. I'm not going to prescribe math at anybody.
I like that version. That version works for me. That's good.
Cool. As with something that I get stuck in a lot and I'm trying to improve at is we know there's a problem. We don't need to spend our entire lives quantifying to the third decimal point where, how big is the problem. If instead we could, if instead we could do something about it. So that's maybe part of why this equation is simpler, is because I did the first one first, and then I was like, okay, no, what? I need a vertical axis. I need something. This one tells us for each industry, what are we missing due to inequity? This delta N from the previous slide, the number of deals that we're missing, talks about, okay, if the sector that you're looking at has a high volume of deals, that number is going to be big because it depends on the number of deals you already have. And the median amount raised in that field, median dollars raised, tells you, is this a space where founders are consistently seeing growth and opportunity, and where the market is responding by giving the startup a high valuation. And as I mentioned here, and as I said out loud a few slides ago, there were several industries in our data set where we did not see, where there wasn't a median valuation for a deal involved, that where a founder of color was involved. So for the graphs that we have in-house, we're basing it on the median for the industry, on the assumption that great ideas come from everywhere. In an equitable world, we would hope to maintain the similar quality of output no matter who's starting a business. Or maybe even higher quality output because a founder is addressing a need that they have experienced, based on their and taking their lived experience and translating it into solutions. All of these are approximations, and I welcome alternative ways of measuring missed opportunity and the gap in access. Now I'm going to start talking about how I have interpreted the graph and its outputs. And then we'll get into the now what space, where I tried to convince Chris to help me code this up in R so we can give a talk about it at SCN or one of the other lovely conferences in the startup world.
That sounds like a great plan. I like
Yeah.
that.
Anybody wants to fly us out to Shenandoah Valley in April? No. Okay. This is basically the graph that we looked at on like slide 4. So okay. The horizontal axis is that gap in deals, that delta N, as a percentage. I translated it into a percentage because otherwise you'd have, something with 100 deals out here, and you couldn't tell everything with like 5 deals back in the middle apart. Percentage thing puts everything on the same horizontal scale. So why is there this gradient? Why does it get greener to the upper left? The okay, so industries A and D are a good starting point. These are industries where, one fortunate piece about them is that, industry D, there is a gap between an equitable amount of funding and the amount that industry D receives, but it's smaller than for any of these 4 industries. So, if you're a founder in industry D, maybe the space is more inclusive than some of these other industries. Maybe there's more access. We don't know why the gap is this small versus this small. The thing that is more, and then we can interpret, okay, for D or for A, what does the vertical axis mean? It means that the effect of closing the gap from here on the horizontal axis to there is going to be maybe 1/3 of the impact of closing a similar gap in industry E, or 1/5 the impact of closing that gap in industry C. So, I'm thinking of the support organizations that we have the privilege to work with in Minnesota, asking about, startups are showing, small businesses have an aggregate $1 billion plus impact on the regional economy. What is the impact of high growth entrepreneurship, this, elitist field relative to that? Why are you focusing on this sliver? This can help us understand or propose, within the startup industry, if creating wealth, if growing access to capital is something we care about, then as we're focusing on startups, maybe industry C could be more impactful at delivering that output. And then we can start asking questions like, okay, well, why is industry C here and not further right or not further left? And what's contributing to that? What impact can we have on it? Um, so this is not the end point. This is the point where you keep asking more questions. Uh, I will show another 2 slides about further questions that I've asked based on charts like this. Uh, this slide includes the sort of cluster that's in the real data outputs that I've looked at. Industries F, G, H, and I are all on this line of maximum inequity. That's the line that talks about there are currently no deals in the data set where a founder of color has raised capital, founding a business like these. So questions we might ask are, are those, well, A, are startups, are people trying to raise capital in those categories and not accessing it? And if so, is there something systematic we can work on? Another question could be, are people starting companies in those categories, but they're being mislabeled, or they're not in some way that means they aren't showing up in our data? Um, and I think the other reason that the gradient gets less green over here is that these are industries where there is a lot of work that needs to be done to bring the system closer to equity. There might be more upstream systemic challenges. There might be a lack of investment capital in those industries based in your region. Like, if founders are succeeding at all in these industries, they might need to travel out of state to get the funding they're looking for. I really haven't looked at them as closely as I should have to figure out what other questions I have about those industries in our region. And industry J down here in the lower left is a reminder that the chart doesn't just, exist in the positive axis of inequity. There are industries in which companies led by founders of color receive a higher percentage of investments than they would at, population parity or small business ownership parity, which is the X equals 0, or the vertical axis. And for these industries, again, they will show up in your data. They are maybe places you can look to understand what could these industries do to move further towards this equitable axis. If your goal is racial equity in your startup ecosystem. Um, and yeah, I think the conclusion I think here is I have found this tool useful as far as identifying blind spots in the startup ecosystem, and I'm looking forward to finding ways to use it to drive conversations and sharing learning from one industry to another that helps move more of these industries closer to uh, equitable access, while also acknowledging the qualitative side, the conversations, the relationships are going to tell us more about how founders are living this process than, dots on a grid will ever do.
Yeah. Ben, I think drawing meaning out of this kind of data. One, it's to me, it's the kind of data that begets more data, right? It's like, okay, so this is something telling us we need to look further and get even more detailed. But I think this can be meaningful in different ways to different ecosystems, to different folks on this chat, perhaps. So would love to hear any questions or comments regarding that. Um, and Ben, from here, I believe, is this your last slide? Did you have more?
This is it. The next one is now what? And I already
Now what? Yeah.
asked Chris to help me with the R code.
Yeah.
So
All right. So Ben and Chris are going to go into a breakout room and start developing in R.
but
But
before we do that, we would love I would love if people from the chat would tell us more about, does this seem useful? Are you left with questions? Did we drop a minus sign somewhere? So all of this is, needs to be refreshed. Um,
and yes, if we don't have any questions, I do have a few discussion questions regarding Forge North and your work there. But yeah, please, anyone watching today have anything to add or ask? Fire away. And so while we wait for anyone to ask anything, I'll keep an eye on the chat, Ben. Well, okay, no questions from the chat so far. So Ben, as other people and organizations try to replicate the success of Forge North in other regions, what are some strategies and best practices that you would recommend for fostering collaboration and driving collective action towards increasing access to early stage capital and promoting racial equity?
Good question. I think the first component is what have been our successes. Um, so two projects that have traction right now focus on educating and building community with and for new angel investors, especially women and people of color. And about a week ago, we announced in partnership with a group called Generator a new fund first investments from a fund uh, investing in women and people of color based in Minnesota. So those are two of our recent successes. We have a conference called Angel Fest coming up on May 2nd to bring some of those angel investors together and give them some more confidence and some more education in their work. And what is great about those two projects is that we're partnering with organizations, and we've this was before I joined the Forge North team, so I'll give credit to Matt Lewis and Meg Stoyer for putting this in motion. We identified partner organizations that were interested in doing something stretched a little beyond the status quo, but still fell within their strengths as a business. There have been a few other projects where it was like, how do we fundraise collectively for entrepreneurs, or how do we consistent, keep communications up with enterprise leaders about their engagement in the startup ecosystem, where we've struggled to find partners where like it was giving them another day job on top of their day job versus learning to do something differently and finding sponsors and partners and investors who would lean into that work alongside them. So play to the existing strengths of your partners is what it boils down to, because Forge North, staff-wise, we're two people. But if we can find ways to help our coalition see their work a little differently, then change has to be systematic or systemic. It's not just us publishing a report and dusting off our hands. It's how do we move the center of massive decision making
Yeah.
with people that in alignment with what people are already working on. How do we give them tools to try something new?
So we have Kate. This is a question from LinkedIn. Kate on LinkedIn asked, I'm curious about how some of these data sources might be leaving out businesses that are disproportionately started by immigrants, like restaurants or beauty businesses, and might raise money from banks. I also have questions about small businesses that women run, how they might be left out of this, and what could be done to get access to different types of funding. Thank you,
That's an
Kate.
important question, Kate. Um, Crunchbase, I appreciate seeing the question because there are a lot of components I want to connect on all of them. Um, Crunchbase leaves out banks as a source of funding, and banks are can be a huge driver, not just of. uh, I'm still learning about the ways that loans and bank-based funding can support high growth startups. And they're obviously a key tool to help restaurants and beauty salons, barber shops, plumbing businesses, all these engines of, helping us keep roofs over our head and, sharing our culture. Those are not included in Crunchbase's reporting. Um, I suspect that there are data sources, that report on the types of bank loans that are going to small business owners, or the types of grants, loans, government programs supporting small businesses. That would include reporting on immigrant status or the gender of the founders. And you could do a similar sort of analysis starting from those data sources. Crunchbase, I don't think would be your friend to start that analysis. You'd have to find the right data source for the types of business you're working with. Um,
Okay.
and yeah, there, I don't know, in Minnesota, groups like Community Reinvestment Fund, Neighborhood Development Center, Northside Economic Opportunity Network, and myriad others and the Groundbreak Coalition are doing work to increase access to different types of funding for businesses like restaurants and beauty businesses. Um, and I'm happy to make an introduction to some people within their
Yeah,
teams.
cool. All right, I think we've got time for just one more quick question here from Leah from LinkedIn, also asking, I'd be curious to see if and or how the philanthropic community, example of Venn Foundation, is addressing these inequities through impact investing.
Jeff Oaks, Venn Foundation are brilliant. I haven't looked for Venn Foundation specifically or Cogent Consulting in this list. Um, but I'm confident that they're part of some of these deals. That would be okay. I think that we would need to identify which investors are impact investors first. Is Brown Venture Group an impact investor because they focus on investing in companies led by people of color? Or is that, are we focused more on like advancing sustainability or gender equity in the outputs of a business? Um, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Um, and maybe to build a bridge between Leah's question and Kate's question, the the form of investment matters because I think Venn Foundation does they do both loans and grant making, um, or maybe loans and equity investments. So only equity investments will show up in the analysis that Forge North is working on, but that's not a complete financial picture, as Kate reminded us.
Got it. Well, great. Ben from Forge North, thank you so much for your presentation and for joining us today on the webinar. Everyone uh, will be posting this video and along with the presentation. And I want to thank all of you so much for coming and for your thoughtful questions and comments in the chat. And Rudy, our marketing, one of our marketing team members here, and Jasmine, big thank you to both of you for helping us with this. And Rudy has also in the chat shared Ben's LinkedIn. So if you're looking to hook up with Ben and talk more about ecosystem building and gaps in capital, I'm sure he'd love to do that. with you. So thank you again all very much for coming. And until the next one, you all have a great and safe rest of your week.